Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Randy Hollick. I'm the Manager of Marketing and Communications for the Division of Extended Education here at the University of Manitoba. And I'd like to welcome you all to our second annual Homecoming webinar, titled The Canadian Skills Agenda, What University Alumni Should Know About the Future of Work, Deciphering Fact from Fiction. We're very excited to have a deeper discussion on this very important emerging topic, and we really appreciate having you join us here today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Now, one quick note about your ability to participate in today's webinar. We'd encourage you to ask any questions you might have using the chat function in Zoom, and we will monitor it closely and incorporate it to the discussion just as best as we can and as time permits. I'd like to take a few moments now to introduce you to today's panelists and our moderator for the webinar. Our first panelist is Rod Lastra, who is the Acting Dean of the Division of Extended Education here at the University of Manitoba. Rod is also President-elect of the Canadian Association for University Continuing Education and an associate member of the European University Continuing Education Network. Rod's current scholarly interests are alternative credentials, lifelong learning, microlearning, skills qualification frameworks, and assessing post-secondary credentials as drivers of social economic mobility. Rod is an alum of the University of Manitoba with a PhD in science, and he recently completed the academic leadership program from the Faculty of Management at Dalhousie University. Previously, Rod served as Associate Dean and Acting Associate Area Director of the University of Manitoba's Access Program. He has been involved in research to better understand post-secondary attainment rates of underrepresented non-traditional learners and has published numerous articles and reports over the past 20 years. Rod also has extensive post-secondary education experience, having taught over 20 undergraduate and graduate level university courses since 2010. Our second panelist today is Yvonne Kinley, Director of Talent and Workforce Development at Economic Development Winnipeg. Yvonne works collaboratively with the Province of Manitoba, Government of Canada, Manitoba Business Council, sector councils, chambers, and post-secondary institutions to facilitate attraction and development of talent needed by private sector businesses interested in expanding their operations or opening new businesses in Winnipeg. Yvonne and her team have developed a plan driven by private sector needs to encourage locally trained youth to stay in Manitoba, attract skilled international workers, increase workforce diversity, and attract skilled Canadians to our province. Yvonne holds a Bachelor of Commerce honors and a master's degree in science, majoring in operations research from the University of Manitoba's Asper School of Business. Prior to joining Economic Development Winnipeg, Yvonne spent 25 years in the private sector, planning and developing technology solutions. And finally, Paul Jenkins is with us as our moderator today. Paul oversees the delivery of online and partnership programming at University of Manitoba Extended Education and serves as president of the Canadian Society for the Study of Higher Education. Paul has devoted his professional life to education and lifelong learning. He has held teaching, research, consulting, and administrative positions at a variety of organizations, including the BBC, a higher education philanthropic foundation, and universities in Canada, the US, and the UK. Paul holds a PhD in history from the University of Glasgow. So I'd like to now turn things over to our moderator to get things going with today's discussion. Paul?
Thank you, Randy, and welcome everyone. Just a little bit of housekeeping here on the format so that we're all clear what's going on. Because today's topic is such a large and complicated one, we're going to begin by having each of our panelists provide a brief opening statement to help frame our topic. Then we'll move on to a moderated discussion that will allow us to unpack the changing nature of today's skills agenda, to explore some of the key trends in today's labor market, as well as to look at our university and educational systems and assess some of the key challenges they confront and what they are doing to better meet them. Finally, if time permits, we will, as Randy said, we will respond to questions from the audience. If there are questions we are unable to answer during the webinar, responses will be provided after the event, and they will be posted on Extended Education's website on the Homecoming webinar page that will be found under the Insights tab on the top of the navigation bar. So with that, I would like to turn the floor over to Rod, who is going to provide us with a brief overview of the Canadian Skills Agenda. Rod.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to begin by actually just kind of highlighting a bit of a preamble in terms of what we're going to be talking about today. Some of what you're going to see in a few minutes is based on some research that I'm doing right now with CAUS, looking at the skills agenda and trying to really better understand the state of the skills agenda within a Canadian and provincial context. Now, from the standpoint of where we need to be, in terms of the skills agenda, one of the things that we need to understand is what does that term actually mean? So in other words, what does a skills agenda actually mean for learners and for those in the private sector and in government? So one of the things that I would like to begin with is providing maybe a high level definition. First of all, the skills agenda is really the nexus of three important things. Number one, it does actually look at the interactions between the labor market, between work qualifications, and specifically the role that education, and in this case, higher education, will play. The aim is really to try to coordinate the education and training that will be required by providers in order to be able to create a responsive system that enables, number one, economic recovery and development, and number two, empowers individuals to improve economic and social mobility. In other words, the ability for individuals to improve their life outcomes. Now, one of the things that we do know is that from a national level, national skills agendas do exist. In fact, in the UK, in the EU, Australia, and Singapore are some examples where national skills agendas are in play. And in those countries, in those places, there is a very clear defined lifelong learning incentives. And by that, I mean incentives to enable lifelong learning within the fabric of a national and international context. There also exist skills and qualifications frameworks, and we'll talk a little bit more about this during the discussion forum. And there are really short cycle learning strategies. In other words, how do we effectively teach skills? How do we effectively teach qualifications? How do we effectively teach competencies? The aim of all this is to really, provide a greater environment for learner mobility at the national and international level. Now, here's the trick. Within Canada, a national strategy does not exist. There are provincial incentives and one-offs that occur here and there, but there is no national strategy. So in the absence of a national strategy, there is a need to better coordinate research and an understanding between federal, provincial, higher education, and business sectors in order to ensure that the outcomes for individuals are kept in mind, and, here's the important and, to avoid the perils of credential inflation. Now, this requires an understanding of the first principles of 21st century skills in the future of work, which I'll briefly try to tie in. So let's talk about a little bit about these first principles. Number one is trying to look at the concept of reimagining learning and to deal with the changing world. Now, from an educational perspective, here's an important point to consider. The relationship between education and work has existed since the first industrial revolution. In fact, one of the things that's really important to note is that every pivot in terms of the condition of work and industrialization, whether it be the first industrialization of the steam engine, fossil fuels, microcomputers, or data, has resulted in direct impacts to education and direct impacts to how we educate the population. Now, in the current context, in the 21st century, the drivers are perhaps a little bit more complicated. The changes that are coming about in terms of skills are informed by things such as the move towards a digital transformation environment, global economy, global disruptions, green economy, changes in demographics, globalization, and urbanization. All of these factors are contributing to what economists call a disequilibrium between labor in the new economy. And the result of that is redefining the future of work and lifelong learning. Now, here's the kicker. All of this informs skills, and the magic word, the skills gap. Now, this is an important factor to consider, because when we talk about the skills gap, there's been enormous investments and enormous projections and from economists around the world. In fact, this year alone at the World Economic Forum, commitments were made to the following thing: skilling 1 billion people by 2030 globally. And here's the thing that we all should pay attention to, really important fact. When economists say that the reason why we need skilling is because we see that as we move towards the digital economy, it's going to input roughly $6.3 trillion into the global GDP and $2 trillion in global GDP as well. So what that signals is that there is a considerable commitment from countries and economists around the world that this investment is a true thing. Within the Canadian workforce, there is an expectation that within the next 5 to 10 years, it will be an additional 6.5 million new skill requirements for the workforce. Now, this is complicated because the pace of change is fast. In fact, I put here the Red Queen hypothesis between the changing skills requirements and what the individuals need to learn. 2016 compared to the year 2000, there was a 30% increase in new skills. By 2030, there'll be a 55% increase, and then the future is unknown. So for learners, what they need to know is, how do you invest? What do you need to understand about the state of tomorrow and the future state? And one of the important aspects here to differentiate when it comes to skilling is that it can be partitioned into two parts. Number one, if you look at the bottom part of the graph, we are transitioning from a labor economy, what we've all known for the last couple of 100 years, towards a digital economy. And the implications of what that means, and by the way, let's think about this, the implications are far more reaching than simply just automation. We're talking about a transformation about the economy and a transformation on the dependency of labor. Now, we all know that the future will be automated. We all know that digitalization is happening, but the adoption rates vary. And currently, at the current state, to roughly about 2030, and by the way, many of you who have done research in this area will realize 2030 is a magic number that most people refer to, is what we call the transition phase. And this transition phase is really the phase of tomorrow. So when we talk about the skilling of tomorrow, we're really talking about the immediate needs that may not necessarily be automation, may not necessarily be digital transformation, but may reflect this transition state that exists in global economies and also informs the local context. Now, it's the future state in which most are writing about the future of work. But in reality, most of the upskilling, reskilling, cross-skilling programs that exist, most of the short cycle micro-credentials that are out there are really addressing that skills of tomorrow, that transition state. And that's an important thing, and I'm sure that Yvonne will talk about the implications of this. The other one is the demographic impacts and the incongruence of skills mismatch. And one of the things that, again, we can delve into the conversation a little later is the tightening labor markets don't quite jive with the fact that we are experiencing near record low unemployment rates nationally. So what informs this? Well, perhaps one of the things that's worth noting is if we look at global population growth rates since the end of the Industrial Revolution to the present, we see that populations have increased exponentially. But here's the important point. Watch this. If we look at the working age trend, the working age trend has almost had a logistic type of leveling off. In fact, one of the things that's really important to note is that this discrepancy, labor force discrepancy, is a real thing. question mark, and perhaps this is a question we can talk with Yvonne, is the skill shortage is not 100% informed by the demographic issues, but certainly is one of the major factors that we need to consider. In Canada alone, from 1960 to the present, 73% of the labor force was within the working age. Now only 52% of the labor force is in that working age. So what does this imply? Well, it implies a few things. It implies that the acceleration and rate of adoption of digital and automation into the workplace is perhaps going to be informed by a tight labor market, by perhaps the fact that there isn't enough people, even if we were to train everyone. In the absence of immigration, perhaps there will always exist that gap, and perhaps that gap is what is driving the adoption rates and the transformation, within work. And that buffer between 2030 and the future may shift depending on how things move forward. So in summary, when we're looking at the future skills agenda from a Canadian perspective, here's what we will require. Number one, we need to acknowledge one important point, is that there is no norm anymore. The new norm will be based on a non-steady state condition where disequilibrium and disruption will be the norm. Greater collaboration between education and business sectors will be absolutely important in order to avoid the neoliberal trap, which maybe we'll get into at this conversation. There will need to be a reimagining in innovations in higher education. The practice of how we learn and how we teach and what we teach has to be reimagined. There has to be a refining of lifelong learning, and the knowledge of skills attainment will be multidisciplinary. The future will be multidisciplinary. And lastly, inclusion of digital transitions and equity of access are going to be pivotal as we move from this transition state to a future state. So now to talk about the local context, Yvonne will provide some perspectives on what's happening here in Manitoba.
So good afternoon. CEOs tell us what keeps them up at night is finding and attracting the talent they need. My colleagues and I talk to businesses every day, and we know the talent gaps have slowed down the local business growth. We also know nationally and internationally owned businesses will choose Manitoba as a place to invest, to open new offices, and to create jobs if we have the talent that they need. The vision for Manitoba is to grow our economy by creating jobs, attracting capital invested, and realizing GDP growth. The goal is a robust economy that provides opportunity for future generations to live, work, and play in Manitoba. And to realize our vision and achieve our goals, we need to build a sustainable talent pipeline. Next slide, please. Next slide, Rod.
Yeah, hang on. It's frozen.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So it used to be that talent followed investment, and now investment follows talent. In other words, businesses will not invest or stay in our province if we don't have a sustainable talent pipeline of high quality skilled workers. Skilled workers earn higher wages. Higher wages contribute to economic growth. High quality employment opportunities increase our office's ability and our province's ability to retain our locally trained youth and to attract skilled workers from other provinces and countries to move to Manitoba. The more highly skilled workers we have, the more business investment we attract. The more businesses we attract, the more high quality jobs we create, and all increasing GDP growth, and enabling us to attract and retain even more high quality talent. Sounds pretty straightforward, but in reality, attracting and retaining talent is very challenging. As Rod had mentioned, there is a global shortage of talent, and COVID has certainly changed the labor market, and it's also changed how businesses operate. Our chief economist we have on staff identified some key factors impacting our market. We know that unemployment of visible minorities, Indigenous people, and those aged 55 plus remain elevated. We also know homeschooling and childcare shortages reduce the number of women in the workforce. Immigration dropped 54% from 2019, and Manitoba's population growth declined from 1.2% in 2019 to 0.71% in 2020. In addition, businesses have changed how they operate. Work from home now enables businesses who don't even operate in our province to poach, or even in our country, as a matter of fact, to poach our local talent. Digital adoption has taken a quantum leap, requiring businesses to invest in reskilling their employees in order for them to function. And in response to COVID, businesses had to create policies and operational practices to support remote work. And now they need to refine those to support a mixed environment that includes in-person, remote, or possibly hybrid work environments. This requiring management to actually gain new skills in change management and human resource management that they've never had before. Our provincial network is strained, and not all remote workers have access to internet services, impacting businesses' access to the rural and remote talent that lives within our province. Recent Statistics Canada data tells us in all provinces except the maritime provinces, unemployment is low and it will continue to decline. And in addition to that, the rate of job vacancies are on the rise. So you can imagine there's that huge labor gap that Rod was talking about. So in short, Canada does not have enough workers to meet the business demand today or in the future. So what is the solution? Well, businesses tell us that higher education is foundational to building that high quality workforce that they're looking for. Our local post-secondary institutions prepare our youth for work, providing robust education that includes classroom and on-the-job training. Postgraduate, they offer Manitobans the opportunity to embrace lifelong learning through market-driven courses and programs. And lastly, they lead research and innovation in partnership with businesses, creating interesting learning opportunities. And yet there are Manitobans who struggle to find meaningful work. And business leaders may not have the skills that they need in order to manage and operate their businesses. So business and post-secondary institutions are working together to build stronger alignment to ensure that all Manitobans do have access to the training they need when they need it, and in a delivery method that's flexible and adaptable. And so without doubt, higher education is very much tied to having a healthy economy. So over to you, Paul.
Great, that's fantastic. I'd like to thank both our panelists for such a succinct yet comprehensive overview or framework for our discussion here. As I was preparing for this webinar and my role here, I found myself thinking about one of the dominant themes in today's world, and that the theme is transformation. And as I'm thinking about this, I keep thinking that there's an intrinsic imprecision and uncertainty in this theme. You know, transformation into what exactly? It's difficult to know with any certainty. What we do seem to be pretty clear on, though, are some of the forces that will be driving this transformation. We've already discussed quite a few of them, you know, demographic change, a rise in rapid acceleration in the knowledge economy, dramatic advances in digital technology. I think we could probably add the ever-present forces of financialization and globalization. And these are only the known forces. I think it's worth reminding ourselves that COVID-19 reminded us that we can't always anticipate everything. And so we need to reserve conceptual and strategic space in our discussions for unknown forces too. Now, when it comes to the future of work, I think it's fair to say, and we've already been touching on this a little bit, that we recognize that to a large extent, the future that workers will experience will depend in crucial ways on the actions they take as individuals to prepare themselves for what's coming. And we also know, with all of these discussions about skills agenda and lifelong learning models and continuing education models, that these actions in turn will depend on the educational opportunities that are open to them. You know, the opportunities they have to skill and reskill, to empower themselves to face an uncertain future. So my question to you both is, I'd like to delve into this a little bit more. What is the role of universities in all of this? And more specifically, I guess, what are the roles of continuing education and lifelong learning models here? Rod, I'd like to begin with you, but in asking this question of you, I wonder if you could maybe touch on some of the key ideas, around different kinds of credentialing we're hearing a lot about in higher education, their merits, whether there are other better ways to validate learning. You also mentioned, credential inflation. Maybe we could begin there.
Thanks, Paul. That's a complicated question, so I'll do my best to answer that, and maybe I'll ask you to guide me along the way if I drift a little bit here. But so the idea of investing in one's future based on education has always been a complex one, and maybe I'll begin by addressing what a university's role is. Well, I think I go back to the merits and mandates of what universities are here to do, which is to provide social value, to provide an intellectual pool, to perhaps serve as sources of innovation, but also to be a little bit disentangled from the immediate realities that maybe govern political agendas and workforce needs. So from a university lens, I think the responsibility we have in higher education is to truly try to comprehend what are going to be authentic needs of the future, to truly try to work together as a collective to ensure that we're speaking somewhat the same language. Now, the reason why that's challenging is because when we're dealing with a degree program, degree programs have qualification frameworks that are well understood. And I've said this before. For instance, if I were to take a chemistry undergraduate program at York, or take one at Calgary, or take one at UBC, I will walk away with essentially the same competencies, knowledge, and skills. If I were to take a programming course as a certificate, not to say that the skills I earn are not important, but oftentimes those skills are defined at a very local level. And sometimes very similar programs will provide differences in terms of specific outcomes. So for the learner who's out there, for the individual who's trying to kind of figure out, okay, well, I need to invest in lifelong learning. Learning will be a fact because skilling will always be a consideration. Companies now are no longer looking at maybe overall qualifications based on degrees, but they want something more. They want proof of skills that they can attain, which means I got to go back and get more credentials. The problem is that you're doing it from a competitive lens to achieve. And where credential inflation comes in, it's not the proliferation of credentials, but just like inflation for your dollar, if inflation goes up, your ability to spend that is going to go down because of the fact that everything goes up. So with credential inflation, you have people who have skills, but everyone has those skills. And there's a finite ability for those people to enter the marketplace. And so from a university perspective, we need to do a really good job in being able to understand the patterns and the oscillations that are happening in the future. And we also need to understand that part of those oscillations is to give room for intellectual thought of processes and to do autocorrections and be part of those autocorrection elements. One quick thing, and I'll hand it over to Yvonne for a commentary, but when it comes to the adoption of digital technologies, one of the things that is a gap is we are very good at creating micro-credentials to train folks to be machine coders, to train folks to do what they need to do, to require skills, by the way, that are oftentimes predefined by government organizations in terms of what they will fund or not fund. So if you want a micro credential that is funded for music, perhaps you'll be looking long and hard. But in this case, what we need to do is ensure that we provide a voice in terms of creating those pivots and specifically looking at the ethics of what's happening. The fast rate of adoption of these transformative things that are happening in the workplace have societal impacts. And as a university, not only do we need to understand how fast we're moving, what is meaningful in terms of credentialing, and I'll get back to this point later, what is authentic learning? How does it fit within the fabric of where we are in society at the moment? But what are the ethics of doing all this as well? And this is where we have the privilege of working within a university setting, a lifelong learning unit like ours, in order to be able to ask those difficult questions that may not have any immediate impacts on our programming agenda, but certainly will have a direction and a mandate of how we do things and when we do things. Yvonne?
Sure. So big question. I'll try, as Rod has, to sort of narrow it down to some really key points. So I'll represent the business's perspective on this in terms of the things that we hear from them. And so I think, first of all, lifelong learning from the business's point of view involves more than just universities. It involves a variety of public and private sector post-secondary institutions. And so I think that that's a really important piece that feeds into what Rod had said, is that it's not likely the university's role to fill every need within the lifelong learning model. And so there's this interesting pivot that has occurred where businesses are struggling to figure out even what their current operating models are due to the changes in our economy, not just COVID, but the supply chain issues as a result of zero tolerance COVID policies and wars and all kinds of things along that line. So the businesses are overwhelmed with figuring out how to keep their operations, how to keep their lights on. And an interesting thing about the Canadian business marketplace is that Canada doesn't have a lot of big businesses. When you look at the size of businesses in Canada, our biggest businesses are small businesses in the United States. And what's important about that is that small businesses tend to have working leaders who have multiple hats that they wear. And so they're very, very busy people. So now you imagine that you have these leaders who are trying to figure out how they redefine their business operations post-COVID, and coupled with figuring out how do I actually engage and align in post-secondary world? How do I communicate? How do I even ask? Rod had mentioned in his preamble that, there's no common language for skills. So how is it that these businesses even know what language to use when asking for skills or asking for new programs and courses? And, the reality of post-secondary institutions like U of M is that they're very large. What door should they knock on? Do they knock on every door of every faculty? How do they engage, right? And so I think that in order for a lifelong learning model to be very much aligned with business, I think that connection between the post-secondaries and businesses is very, very important. And I think it's also very important to understand the supports that they're going to need in order for them to even define what it is that they're looking for, and to be able to properly engage with post-secondaries in ways that post-secondaries know what to do with what they're being asked of. But what I do know for sure is that with the reduced workforce, that they're looking for high level productivity out of the current staffing that they have. And, that transition piece is going to be very important, because the automation that Rod had referred to isn't here yet. So it's that transition period of how do we grow our businesses? How do we keep our GDP growing? How do we stay a wealthy country when we have a declining workforce and we have people retiring earlier, which means that maybe the productivity or the knowledge is lost? And and how can the university support in finding those students who graduate from programs, or maybe creating those market-driven programs that they're needed? And so, I think that it's a very complicated topic, and I think the solution is, these groups within our talent ecosystem who may not have worked together, to work together in different ways, to share the pieces that they have, and to figure out what that model might look like, so that these small businesses can actually continue to operate and offer jobs to Manitobans.
Great, thank you. I mean, it is an incredibly large question, and I think we've done a nice job, though, really highlighting a couple of things. One, universities occupy a particular place in the educational ecosystem. Two, that educational ecosystem is becoming increasingly dynamic and complex, and part of what's making it so dynamic and complex, in my view anyway, is a triangulation really between educational institutions, learners, and businesses and employers. And this conversation is really kind of swirling. One of the things that, as manager of delivery, I work with a lot of industry partners and stakeholders, and one of the things that I hear a lot about is, or a lot of requests for, is faster and cheaper educational options. There's a lot of pressure here to create something that is short, tight, and focused, that can be done in a relatively short period of time, and that is, as you're saying, Yvonne, more affordable. Resources are scarce, and businesses are trying to grow themselves. So I'm wondering here, if I could ask you both, what are the challenges here? How do we gauge and ensure the value of short cycle programming, short focused programs? Rod, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so thanks, Paul. Lovely question. I like that. So I think, the accessibility aspect of it is a really important one. And I think that institutions working alongside with the province and perhaps the business sector need to make some commitments to the value proposition of workforce development skills. And I say that intentionally because I think that's where there's going to be multiple buy-ins from multiple stakeholders. We can look at examples that are happening in Ontario, Alberta, and BC, which have not yet surfaced here in Manitoba, which are commitments that are leading to funding opportunities, loan opportunities for those who are taking short cycle learning programs and courses that have a direct benefit and are short-lived. Underscore that point, are short-lived. Because again, we don't want to saturate the market, and I think we do recognize that these things do change over time. So that's the easy answer when it comes to the financial bit. For a unit like ours in extended education, one of the aspects that we need to contend with is revenue. And what I mean by that is, I think that units like ours across the country need to balance a cost recovery and putting programs out that have value. And at times, that's where I think there's a bit of a sticking point of where do we find that middle ground? What commitments and what are we able to do to increase accessibility? Because the reality is that regardless of where you sit on the spectrum, and regardless of if you agree that the inability, and I think Yvonne did an excellent job summarizing the fact that we don't have huge companies here in Canada, and that perhaps informs the trend towards divesting in internal training and putting that training outside of the walls of the organization. But from our perspective, I think that we need to understand what that means for the learner, what that means in terms of whereas before those experiences, those things that you would get on-the-job training was free, something that would enable you to leverage up within the corporation and company. Now you need to pay for it. But what if you're not part of that? What if you are part of not a privileged class, but a marginalized member of society? How are we going to address that gap? And sociologists are certainly concerned about the reality of digitalization and the reality of the new skills future in the future of work and the implications this will have on an unsustainable civic impact to people. Now, last question that you asked was related to short. We've got to be careful with what we mean by short. There is short and there is authentic learning that can be short. So there is possibilities if we take a look at micro-learning, for example, theory, that we can identify specific skills that we can teach during a period of 5, 7, 12 weeks. And those skills are probably easy to test and easy to attain. Others are competency-based, where time and seat is not meaningful. So for us, when we offer these responsive programs, one of the things that we need to kind of understand is, well, where does the quote unquote skill lie? Is it a competency-based model where we want to ensure that there's a certain level of proficiency and understanding before the person progresses? We're even providing people with the opportunity to challenge on a final test without having to take the content, kind of a prior learning approach, or the traditional time and seat element of saying you're going to take this program and you're going to complete these elements of this program over 12 weeks or 13 weeks. So when it comes to the duration, those are important factors that we need to kind of ask ourselves is how do we identify those skills? How best are those skills going to be delivered? And how does that inform the structure of the program and perhaps even, the funding models that go with that? Now, I can tell you, outside of the accreditation world, competency-based education is difficult. It is difficult because provinces want quick turnaround. They want to be able to ensure that people can be quote unquote trained over a period of time. They can be trained, but this is where, to your previous point, Paul, as universities, we need to be thoughtful about how we execute these programs, not just putting any content within 12 weeks and calling it let's say, a micro-credential and saying you'll get these skills. Last point, and Yvonne, I'll leave it to you, dispositions and skills, an important distinction between the two. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't teach, dispositions in a short order of time, but it's difficult. So here's what I mean. Leadership is a skill, but it's an innately dispositional characteristic of people. There is neurological networks in your brain that determine your ability to communicate well, to engage with others, to have those leadership, characteristics that are so wanted. But the reality is, and many scholars would agree, you can't teach that in 4 weeks. And if you do, you better pick your learners very carefully to have those dispositions. Because otherwise, if you don't have those dispositions of good communication and leadership skills, it's going to take you way longer to acquire them in a short cycle learning program. Well, I guess it won't be short cycle learning program if it's longer, but you understand what I'm saying. Yeah. So there are multifaceted approaches that I think from an educational perspective, we need to be very cognizant of. Yvonne?
Actually, before that, I wondered if in redirecting the question to you, Yvonne, if we could pick up on this theme of accessibility, because it seems to me there are 3 elements there that you might have some interesting insights on. I mean, one would be technological and connectivity issues in terms of access. The other might be the need for more alternate pathways to higher education. And a third would maybe hit those communities with historically low participation in higher education. And so, questions of equity, diversity, inclusion, all of that kind of thing. What insights or are you encountering any, what are you hearing from the business community, I suppose, when it comes to those kinds of things?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the business community is certainly very interested in diversity and inclusion in their hiring practices. And the limitations of our provincial network, or the limited access that individuals might have to enjoy some of those applied learning or experiential learning opportunities if they're in a remote community, prevent them from getting that full suite of skills, right? So we talk about value, and to me, value isn't just the classroom training. The value to the employer is that within a short period of time, so if we use the word short, within a short period of time, that individual that went for training can increase their productivity, right? Because we talked about the need for people to be more productive. And I think that some of these disadvantaged groups miss out on that opportunity to demonstrate their productivity because they don't have access to the same variety of learning environments that somebody who lives in Winnipeg in an urban center. And so experiential learning is exactly one of those pieces, right? But to build on, what value means, I think that it's dangerous to assume that the post-secondaries should own the whole responsibility or accountability to ensure that there's value. I firmly believe, and I know many businesses operate this way, is that they also have a role. And so in order for them to get the value, as I mentioned, they have to apply what they've learned. Classroom training, everyone knows you learn something in a classroom and it's not sufficient. You need to be able to take what you've learned in a classroom and you need to be able to apply it. Now we have this issue where we have a lot of small businesses who don't have individuals to provide that mentorship that's necessary in the work environment, which is exactly why some of the small businesses aren't able to hire co-op students, because they just don't have people to help, right? They need that mentorship role. And what's interesting is in other countries, they're actually tapping on their retired community to take on these mentorship roles in volunteer capacity. And, I know U of M has programs like that. And so I think value belongs to the ecosystem. It belongs to those who are retired. It belongs to the post-secondary institutions, the businesses, the friend groups, or whoever that might be, to create that person who is now ready for that new challenge in their career. And it's not as straightforward as I'm going to take a course, I'm going to graduate from that course, and I'm going to be suddenly a more productive worker. I think that the credentialing piece was kind of an easy way for everyone to demonstrate that value, because the thing about credentials is there's very specific testing that occurs, for these different programs. They're established testing programs. But I think we've moved into a new era where we're saying that people don't need to be over-credentialed, they need to gain a skill. So the question is, how do you actually test that they have that skill, right? So to me, it's all of those things. And I think the package is just requiring all these people, like as mentioned earlier, I really think it's the talent ecosystem working together. I think it's figuring out how to test people, and those underrepresented groups don't always perform well in the traditional testing models, right? Maybe they need a new or different, flexible or more sensitive way of testing. Again, we could go on and on for a long time on this topic, but I really do think it's getting away from one size fits all and assuming a credential is what's needed, and really thinking about what is that skill someone's trying to acquire and who needs to be at the table contributing to ensuring that these individuals are able to gain the skills and be productive workers.
Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, and I certainly appreciate there seems to be a real need for educational options or solutions that are problem driven as opposed to sort of content centered. Rod.
Yeah, and I was just going to build on a point that Yvonne made. Yvonne, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that's the whole idea of a skills agenda, and why it's important to, even in the absence of having a national strategy, it's important to kind of take the principles of a skills agenda and start working on that. Why? Absolutely. Higher education doesn't have all the answers, nor should they. I think in order to kind of work in this space, we need to collaborate. We need to understand what individuals need. We need to understand what industry, private sector, and we also need to understand that, the very philosophical discussions and thought processes that can happen in both realms, and in both the business sector and in higher education. There's an opportunity to bring those ideas together, and sometimes to forge pathways and things that can provide authentic ways forward, right? The other point I was going to make, which is kind of tangential, but it's related to all this, is going back to accessibility. It's not just higher education that is responsible for this. We can do all we like in terms of providing higher education skilling opportunities for members of our population. But truth be told, that within our Indigenous community here in Manitoba alone, a majority of the First Nations communities up north do not have a high school embedded in them. So when we talk about work integrated learning, and we talk about upskilling, reskilling, that's great, but that's not a reality that many people could take, because of the fact that the educational system needs to be rethought. There needs to be innovations in terms of what's happening K to 12. There needs to be investments and commitments from politicians and policymakers to change what is happening to a lot of these marginalized communities, where if there isn't radical change done at the K to 12 level, at the societal level, we are going to be in for kind of a sociological problem, economic problem in the next 20 years. So I think that responsibility, again, falls outside the realm of what we can do within higher education. We can only provide so many transition programs or so many upskilling programs. There comes a point where there needs to be commitments and investments in the K to 12 space.
Well, this is this line of discussion swings neatly into my next question, actually, and I'd really like for our audience to be able to take something away from this webinar, some insights that they might apply, some new approaches. So, I guess the question is, how do we best bridge the skills gap? What do we do here? This is homecoming week too, so what should our alumni know here? What can we do now to make things better?
Naomi?
Yeah, maybe if either of you really, I'll just open it up, but another big question.
Do you want me to go, Rod?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think when I look at, university students, there's well-established programs that provide fantastic foundational knowledge that I know businesses truly value. They tell us that all the time. They love hiring U of M grads. They, they think that they come out and, they're just, fantastic foundational knowledge. I think what I hear from the businesses most is that they are wishing that the students would have more chances to have tried out different work opportunities and gain business experience, right? And there's skills that you need to have in order to have a job, and there, those skills include, how to perform in a meeting, or how to use your email, or there's some really basic things that need to have, and often they call these the soft skills or the power skills, or whatever label that you want to have them. And the way to improve those skills is just by sheer practice, right? It's like everything else, practice makes perfect. And it's those work opportunities that I think are really important in helping young people, or whatever age you might be, if you've returned to a university environment, to gain the skills that the post-secondaries just aren't there to necessarily provide. And I think that that's what I was referring to, earlier, is that the businesses have a role, and the business's role is to give those opportunities while you're a student. And I think that there also needs to be the concept that, you don't have to graduate from a specific faculty to be able to qualify for certain roles, unless, of course, it's one of these regulatory areas like a nurse or a doctor. You definitely need to, or an engineer. There's obviously ones that you have to go through. But I think that the people going through, arts and sciences programs, I think that the students in those programs need to stop and think about how do they articulate the skills that they have, and how do they align with what the businesses want, right? And so I'll take an art student, for example, likely great writing and communication skills. Instead of just saying, I have an arts degree with a major in history, you might want to articulate on your resumes or in your interviews, how does that translate into a work skill? Which is, can you communicate? Can you collaborate with others? And those communication and collaboration and teamwork are so important in the workforce. And yet there's no specific course on that, right? And so I think that would be, the takeaway I would provide any students who might be listening, as to how to translate the great things that you're able to do into business language, so that you look and stand out and get that job.
Yeah, excellent advice. In certain respects, I do wonder whether the skills gap is more apparent than real in that sense. I've been long struck by art students. They could learn a lot from science and engineering students in terms of translating the skills they have as actually skills, as opposed to content that they know. Rod.
Yeah, no, I would agree with all points. I mean, I will simply just add a couple of things to consider. From a higher education perspective, I think, how do you address the skills gap is you better understand what it means by skilling, right? What is a skill? What is knowledge? What is competency? We better have a working understanding of what that means. A skills framework is certainly, required. A qualification framework is certainly required. Labor Market Information Council, the LMIC, is currently working on kind of redefining those qualifications and those NOC standards into something new, perhaps. And I think that's a move in the right direction. But I think that we need to certainly have that. Why? Because I think that language will provide opportunities for mobility. So we know that there are, pragmatic gaps that we can fill in at the moment, and we know that those things can be done. But the value-added proposition is making sure, again, we understand the language. We're not using it as a general free-for-all. Skilling has a very specific intent. And if you go to Europe, if you go to the UK, if you go to, to Australia, there's really sophisticated approaches in terms of how they're doing this and the positive impacts it's having on learners and the ability to be mobile. we're still not quite there yet at a national level. And I do like the idea of what Yvonne said. I mean, being self-aware. Higher education does provide you with a lot of stuff. You know, my PhD background, I was a biologist, an ecologist to be exact. I think I learned a lot of, I suppose you can call them essential skills, soft skills that were never quantified by anybody, but I think really helped me propel my career and where I am today. Not so much the ability to be able to recognize complex mathematical models in ecology, but to be able to apply that critical thinking. All of us who were in higher education have those skills. Unfortunately, we don't do a very good job in higher education in underscoring what those skills are. And it's surprising how much people don't know about what they do know. And that's a really important fact. Now, from our perspective, from a scaling perspective, I think what we're working with right now, the university is really trying to move the envelope here. I think there is, concerted effort at the U of M to really try to address this whole issue as a collective. Within extended education, I think one of the things that we want to do is to ensure that the very thing that that Yvonne was saying, we're not quite there in terms of providing that leverage for students who have that formal education background, but for those who are taking courses with us or short programs, to provide them with those learning outcomes, with those soft, technical and other skills, and articulated perhaps in a digital credential, and something that they can walk away with, which is validated and authenticated by the institution, and that they can use and could be a vehicle for mobility outside of Manitoba, outside of Canada, perhaps. So I think those strategies are where there is a collective effort, a national effort across the country, that in the absence of that skilling agenda, to be able to, again, as Yvonne mentioned, empower the learners to say, listen, you know more than you think you know. Leverage your education. You may not get that job in history, right? Or you may not get that job in chemistry, but there's something that you walked away with that's probably equally as valuable, right? And that's something that we call cross-skilling, transversal, mechanisms of trying to take that knowledge that you do have. Anyways, I'll leave it at that.
Well, yes, that's a great encouraging note to end on. I'm mindful of the time. I would like to remind everyone in the audience, if we haven't answered your questions, we will address them if we haven't already. And with this, I'd like to throw it back to Randy to see us through to completion. And I'd like to thank our panelists.
Yes. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Paul. Just in closing, on behalf of the Division of Extended Education at the University of Manitoba, I'd really like to thank all of you for joining us today. And as Paul says, thanks to our panelists, Rod and Yvonne, and to Paul for moderating this discussion, and for everyone for sharing their insights with us. Just a final note, you will receive a brief survey immediately following today's session to gather any comments or feedback you'd like to share with us. And you'll also receive a follow-up email in the days ahead, and it'll have a link to the web page where you'll find the recording of today's webinar, along with the responses to any questions that we didn't have the opportunity to answer in real time. So thank you all for attending. We hope to see you once more at one of our future webinar events.
I do have, I'm sorry, I do have one last thing to mention very quickly. I want to make sure that we put our money where our mouth is. So in light of what we just talked about accessibility, Extended Education will be launching an alumni discount for U of M alumni effective January 2023, enabling learners who are coming back to take a course at Extended Education and get 25% off on their first course. Information will be posted on our website and details to come, but I just wanted to announce that in terms of our commitments to this whole issue of accessibility and affordability.